I am glad to welcome you to my channel Sinister Horror Stories. Before we start the story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Story 1.
I needed this weekend away more than I cared to admit. The relentless grind of city life had worn me thin, and when Emma suggested a quiet getaway, I jumped at the chance. After scrolling through countless listings on Airbnb, we finally found a secluded cottage that seemed perfect, an old stone house surrounded by dense trees, far from the noise and stress of the city. The photos showed a place that felt timeless, with ivy climbing the walls and a cozy interior filled with vintage charm. As we drove further from the city, my tension began to melt away. The road wound through forests and hills, each turn taking us deeper into the kind of solitude I hadn't realized I craved. By the time we pulled up to the cottage, the late afternoon sun was casting a warm glow over everything, making the place look like a scene from a storybook. Mr. and Mrs. Graves, the elderly couple who owned the cottage, were waiting for us on the porch. They looked exactly as I'd imagined from the reviews. Mr. Graves with his thick gray beard and stern demeanor. Mrs. Graves with her hair neatly pinned back, her smile warm but a little too wide. They welcomed us with open arms, almost as if we were family, and showed us around the house with a kind of pride that made me wonder just how many guests they'd entertained over the years. The interior was just as charming as the photos had promised. Antique furniture, a large stone fireplace, and thick curtains that blocked out the outside world. It was exactly what we'd been looking for, yet as we settled in, I couldn't shake a subtle feeling of unease. The Graves were hospitable, but there was something in the way they watched us, a lingering intensity in their eyes that made my skin crawl. As Emma unpacked, she hummed to herself, completely at ease. I tried to match her mood, but my mind kept drifting back to the way Mrs. Graves had touched my arm, as she'd shown us the bedroom, her grip just a little too tight, her smile just a little too fixed. It was probably nothing, just my overactive imagination. But as we lay in bed that night, the house grew unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. I finally drifted off to sleep, but not before checking the lock on the bedroom door twice. I told myself it was just to be cautious. New places always made me a little uneasy. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something about this place didn't sit right with me, and as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I woke up in the middle of the night, the room bathed in an eerie light from the moon filtering through the curtains. My throat was dry and my mind felt foggy, like I'd been dreaming but couldn't remember what about. I glanced over at Emma, who was still sound asleep, her breathing slow and steady. She looked peaceful, completely oblivious to the sense of unease that had me wide awake. Unable to sleep, I decided to get up and get a glass of water. As I crept down the stairs, trying not to wake Emma, the house felt different, more sinister somehow. The walls seemed to close in, and every creak of the floorboards echoed louder than it should have. I made my way to the kitchen, but as I passed the living room, something caught my eye. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see a faint glow. The fireplace was still burning, even though we'd left it to die down hours ago. But that wasn't what made my heart skip a beat. It was the voices, low, murmuring, and unmistakably coming from the living room. I froze, straining to hear. The voices were hushed, like they were discussing something they didn't want overheard. Slowly I inched closer to the door, peering through the gap. What I saw made my blood run cold. Mr. and Mrs. Graves were sitting by the fire, but they weren't alone. 3 figures were seated in the shadows, their faces hidden from view. The way they sat, perfectly still, and the low, droning tone of their conversation sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but the atmosphere was thick with something dark, something wrong. A wave of panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a side table. The noise made one of the figures glance toward the door, and I bolted, running back up the stairs 2 at a time. I slammed the bedroom door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Emma stirred, blinking sleepily as she sat up. "Mark, what's going on?" I hesitated, trying to catch my breath. "We need to leave," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. "Something's wrong here." She frowned, clearly still half asleep. "What do you mean? What happened?" "There were people downstairs," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "With the Graves, they were talking, but something about them, I don't know, it wasn't right. We need to go, Emma. Now. She looked at me like I was crazy, but there must have been something in my expression that convinced her. She nodded, throwing the covers off and getting dressed quickly. We packed our bags in a hurry, the tension between us thickening with every minute that passed. As we headed downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those hollow eyes were still on us. The house was eerily quiet, but I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on us, suffocating us. When we reached the front door, I was ready to bolt, but as I reached for the doorknob, it turned on its own. Mrs. Graves stood on the other side, smiling up at us like she'd been expecting us. "Leaving already?" she asked, her voice sweet but laced with something that made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, we need to get back to the city. Something came up." Her smile didn't waver. "That's a shame. We were hoping you'd stay a bit longer. Enjoy the peace and quiet." My heart raced as I lied. "Maybe another time." She didn't move, just kept smiling at me, her eyes boring into mine. "Of course. But before you go, why don't you have some breakfast? It's all ready in the dining room." I glanced at Emma, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. We couldn't refuse without raising suspicion, so we nodded and followed Mrs. Graves into the dining room. The table was laid out with a full breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, everything you could want. But as I sat down, my appetite vanished. The smell of the food was nauseating, and all I could think about was getting out of that house. Mrs. Graves poured us both coffee, her eyes never leaving mine. "You know," she said softly, "most of our guests never want to leave. They find the peace and quiet irresistible." I forced a smile, but inside, I was screaming. "I'm sure it's lovely," I said, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. She watched me for a moment longer before turning to Emma, who had already taken a sip of her coffee. "And you, dear? How do you like it here?" Emma hesitated, glancing at me. "It's nice." There was something wrong with the coffee, bitter, metallic. I set my cup down, pushing back from the table. "Emma, we need to go." Mrs. Graves's smile faltered, just for a second before she regained her composure. "So soon? You've hardly touched your breakfast." I didn't answer. I stood, pulling Emma with me as we hurried to the door. The silence in the house was deafening, and I could feel the weight of Mrs. Graves's gaze on my back as we left. We practically ran to the car, throwing our bags in the back and jumping in. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but finally, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me as I backed out of the driveway, but it was short-lived. The car lurched, the engine sputtering, and then it died. Panic surged through me as I tried again and again to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. I glanced up, and there on the porch stood Mr. Graves, his hands in his pockets, watching us with that same calm, unreadable expression. "Mark, what's happening?" Emma's voice was rising in panic. "I don't know," I muttered, trying the key again. The engine coughed and finally caught, roaring to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as we shot backward out of the driveway, narrowly avoiding the gate. We sped down the road, the trees whipping past us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Graves cottage still looming behind us, but it was gone, swallowed by the forest. As the road stretched out in front of us, the tension in the car began to ease, but the unease in my gut didn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left, that somehow the Graves had marked us, and that mark was still with us, following us. When we finally reached the city, the familiar sights of civilization brought a small measure of comfort. We pulled up in front of our apartment, and I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We were home, safe. But as we stepped inside, the apartment felt different, colder, emptier. Emma went straight to the bathroom, and I could hear the water running as she splashed her face. I stood in the living room, staring out the window at the city lights, trying to shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. That night, the nightmares began. I woke up drenched in sweat, the images of the cottage, the graves, and those hollow-eyed figures flashing through my mind. Every creak in the apartment, every shadow on the wall made my heart race. I could tell Emma was struggling too. She was quieter, more distant, like the experience had drained something vital from her.
Thank you for listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Share your impressions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.